The story begins at a time of grandeur in the Empire of Persia. King Ahasuerus, who ruled over a vast territory stretching from India to Ethiopia, decided to organize a magnificent celebration. For 180 days, he displayed his immense wealth, the power of his kingdom, and the splendor of his glory. It was a show of strength and abundance that showed everyone, nobles and governors alike, that he was a king above any other. At the end of these 6 months of ostentation, the king planned an even more extravagant banquet, which lasted 7 days. This banquet was held in the gardens of the royal palace, decorated with white and blue linen curtains attached to silver rings on marble columns. The couches were of gold and silver, placed on a pavement of precious stones. Wine flowed freely in golden cups, and each guest could drink to their heart's content. As this was the king's command, the celebration should reflect his generosity and greatness. Meanwhile, Queen Vashti was also hosting a banquet for the women in the royal palace. Although her event was not as grand as that of the king, it was equally important and reflected the dignity of her role as queen. On the 7th day of the feast, with a heart joyful for wine and a pride in being a powerful king, Ahasuerus had an idea. He wanted everyone present to admire the beauty of his queen. He ordered 7 eunuchs to go to Vashti and bring her before him, wearing her royal crown, so that her beauty would be displayed before the nobles and the people. But, to everyone's surprise, the queen's answer was a categorical no. She refused to comply with the king's request. Although the Bible does not clearly explain her reasons, we can imagine that Vashti could have felt humiliated or uncomfortable being paraded as a trophy in front of so many men. His decision was bold, especially at a time when women were expected to obey without question. Vashti's refusal caused an uproar in the palace. How could the king tolerate such disobedience, especially in public? He, who was the ruler of a vast empire, had been challenged by his own queen. Ahasuerus was furious, and his anger was so great that he immediately sought advice from his sages, the closest and most influential men in the kingdom, who knew the laws and traditions of the Persians. The king's advisors were concerned about the impact of this act. They argued that if Vashti's disobedience was not punished, all women in the empire could follow her example and disrespect their husbands. This, according to them, would be a disaster for the order and customs of the kingdom. Convinced by his advisors, Ahasuerus made a difficult but necessary decision in the eyes of his council. Vashti would be stripped of her position as queen. His crown would be removed, and another woman, more worthy in the eyes of the king, would take his place. A decree was issued, proclaiming that each man should be lord in his own house, and that Vashti's disobedience would not be tolerated as an example. With this decision, Vashti disappeared from history, but her refusal was the event that began a series of events that would change the fate of the entire Jewish people. This crisis in the palace would pave the way for Esther, a humble young woman full of grace and courage, to become the new queen and the heroine of one of the most beautiful stories in the Bible. The decree to choose a new queen after Vashti's dismissal, the royal palace was plunged into a climate of expectation and unrest. Although King Ahasuerus had acted with conviction in withdrawing the queen's title, the void left by her absence was notorious. The king's advisors, realizing the need to restore order and strengthen the image of royalty, suggested a bold plan: select a new queen to occupy the throne alongside Ahasuerus. Thus, a royal decree was issued, reaching all the provinces of the vast Persian Empire. The order was clear and detailed. The king's officials were to fetch the most beautiful young women from each region and bring them to the citadel of Shushan, where they would be presented to the king. Not only did this decree spread quickly, but it also generated a wave of anticipation and curiosity among the families of the kingdom. In the citadel of Shushan, preparations were already in full swing. The selected young women had to undergo a long period of beauty treatments and special care, supervised by Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the royal harem. He would have the task of preparing each candidate to be in top shape before being presented to the king. Among the young women chosen was Esther, a young woman of Jewish origin who lived in Shushan. Esther was an orphan and had been raised by her cousin Mordecai, a wise and God-fearing man, who treated her as if she were his own daughter. Although Esther was of humble origins, her natural beauty was stunning, but it wasn't just her appearance that drew attention. Esther also possessed a grace and wisdom that made her special, qualities that Mordecai had cultivated in her with great love and care. When the king's emissaries arrived at Esther's home, Mordecai likely felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. He knew this could be a great opportunity, but he also understood the challenges and dangers his young cousin would face as she entered the world of Persian royalty. Before Esther was taken, Mordecai gave her vital advice, not to reveal her Jewish origin to anyone. He knew that this information could put her at risk, and it was necessary for Esther to be prudent and wise in every step she took. Upon arriving at the palace, Esther immediately stood out among the other young women. Her humility, combined with her beauty and character, won over Haggai, who came to favor her. He treated her with special attention, ensuring that Esther received the best care and the best position within the harem. Although Esther was in a place of luxury and privilege, you can imagine how challenging this experience must have been for her. Far from Mordecai and his community, she now found herself in an environment filled with intrigue and competition, where each young woman sought to draw the king's attention to herself. However, Esther remained faithful to the teachings she had received, demonstrating patience, wisdom, and a discreet confidence that were as rare as her beauty. As the palace prepared for the moment and King Ahasuerus would choose his new queen, a larger plot began to unfold behind the scenes. Esther was unknowingly about to become a key player in God's plan to save her people. But at that moment, she was just a brave and humble young woman, guided by God's providence, which was silently leading her to a purpose far greater than she could have imagined. Esther is taken to the palace. The moment of Esther leaving for the palace was surrounded by expectation and emotion. The young woman, raised with so much care by Mordecai, now left the simple and cozy home to enter an environment full of luxury, but also of intrigue and challenges. Mordecai, who regarded her as a daughter, watched as Esther followed the king's emissaries. He knew that his cousin possessed rare qualities, but also that the palace environment was complex and often dangerous. Before she left, Mordecai reminded her once more, "Do not reveal your origin or your lineage." Upon arriving at the palace, Esther was immediately noticed. Not only was her physical beauty impressive, but so was her manner of being, graceful, kind, and humble. It was as if she carried a light that illuminated the environment she passed through. This caught the attention of Haggai, the eunuch responsible for the young women who competed to be the new queen. Haggai, an experienced man accustomed to dealing with people of all classes and backgrounds, soon realized that Esther was different. There was something about her that transcended mere appearance. She was respectful but not subservient, charming, but without arrogance. In a place where so many sought attention at any cost, Esther conquered for what she was, without apparent effort. Haggai, impressed, decided to give Esther special treatment. She was given the finest quarters in the harem, carefully decorated and equipped with everything that could make her feel comfortable. In addition, Esther was surrounded by the best advisors and servants, ensuring that she had everything she needed to prepare for the big moment of presenting herself to the king. But the preparations went beyond luxury and comfort. Each young woman went through a rigorous period of beautification, which included treatments with precious oils and perfumes. The objective was to enhance the natural beauty of each one and prepare them for the meeting with King Ahasuerus. For Esther, this period was a mixture of novelty and challenge. Although she was in a completely new place, far from everything she knew, she maintained her serenity and confidence. While many young women in the harem probably competed with each other, Esther stood out for another reason: her kindness. She treated everyone around her with respect and consideration, from the other candidates to the palace servants. His way of acting captivated not only Haggai, but everyone who crossed his path. Haggai, who had already shown his appreciation for Esther, went further. He saw to it that she had the best clothes and jewelry, and even instructors who could teach her about the customs of the palace and how to behave before the king. He seemed certain that Esther had something special, something that set her apart from all the others. As Esther prepared to meet King Ahasuerus, something bigger was happening behind the scenes. Although she didn't know it, God was leading her to a crucial role in the history of the Jewish people. Each step he took inside the palace was another piece of the divine plan being put into practice. Esther might not fully understand why she was there, but her humility and wisdom helped her stand out. She trusted the advice of Mordecai, who followed everything closely, even from a distance, and acted prudently in all situations. In the heart of the palace, Esther continued to prepare, unaware that the fate of not only hers, but the entire nation of Israel, was about to be impacted by her presence there. The choice of Esther as queen, the day has finally come. After long months of preparation, it was Esther's turn to be presented to King Ahasuerus. In the great hall of the palace, everything seemed even more imposing than Esther had imagined. The marble columns reflected the soft light of the golden lamps, while the air was impregnated with the aroma of incense and rare spices. It was a majestic environment, but full of expectation. Esther, wearing a dress that enhanced her natural beauty and wearing jewels carefully chosen by Haggai, walked down the aisle toward the royal throne. His stance was firm, but not arrogant. His eyes showed serenity, but also humility. She knew it wasn't just her appearance that mattered at that moment. What really set her apart from the others was something deeper, something that couldn't be adorned or taught: her character. King Ahasuerus, seated on his golden throne, watched intently as Esther approached. He had met many young women before her. Each one brought its own grace and charm, but there was always something missing. With Esther, however, it was different from the first moment. As soon as his eyes crossed hers, the king felt something he had never felt before. Esther bowed respectfully before the king, with a gesture that mixed reverence and dignity. When he began to speak, his voice was soft, but full of sincerity. Ahasuerus realized that there was something special about this young woman. It wasn't just her appearance, though she was undoubtedly beautiful, but something that came from within. A combination of kindness, intelligence, and calmness. King Ahasuerus found himself captivated by Esther in a way that no other young woman had ever been able to. He didn't need much time to make his decision. Rising from his throne, he declared before all present that Esther would be his new queen. It was as if he knew, deep in his soul, that she was the right choice, even without fully understanding why. The announcement was greeted with applause and celebrations throughout the palace. Esther, however, remained serene. Despite the joy she felt, she knew she was there for a greater purpose. She also did not forget Mordecai's advice, not to reveal her Jewish origin. The moment was festive, but Esther was fully aware that her identity should remain a secret for now. The preparations for the coronation were grandiose. Esther was adorned with the royal robe and crown, symbolizing her new position as queen of all Persia. The people of Shushan were invited to a great banquet in celebration of the new queen, and news of Ahasuerus' choice spread rapidly throughout the provinces of the vast empire. Although she was surrounded by luxury and celebrations, Esther didn't let that change who she was. Deep down, she remained the simple and kind young woman raised by Mordecai. Someone who carried with her unshakable values. Now, as queen, she understood that she would have new responsibilities and challenges ahead. As the people celebrated and the palace echoed with songs and laughter, Esther knew that her journey was just beginning. She had been chosen for something much bigger than a throne or a crown. Without anyone suspecting it, God had placed her in that strategic place to fulfill a purpose that would transform the destiny of an entire nation. Mordecai discovers a conspiracy. The sun was already setting over the citadel of Shushan, and the palace gates, always busy, were beginning to be still. Mordecai, as was his custom, was there, watching the coming and going of people, attentive to everything that happened. Although he was only a cousin of Esther and a simple man, his frequent presence at the gates made him a shrewd observer of events in the palace. He knew that every murmur, every expression, or exchange of glances could reveal something important. That afternoon, two of the king's officials, Bigthan and Teres, were in a far corner, talking heatedly. Mordecai, ever attentive, sensed the conspiratorial tone in his words. He approached discreetly, positioning himself so that he could listen without being noticed. What he heard made his heart race. The two men planned to take the life of King Ahasuerus. Bigthan, his voice full of hatred, murmured, "This king, with his endless feasts and impulsive decisions, is past the time to rule. The time has come to put an end to this." Teres, agreeing, added, "And we are in the right place to do it." No one will suspect us. Mordecai knew he needed to act quickly. Loyalty to the king, even as a foreign ruler, was essential to the stability of the empire and, even more so, to the security of Esther, who now held the place of queen. He wasted no time and immediately went to Esther to tell her what he had discovered. Esther listened intently to Mordecai's words. His expression became serious, for he understood the gravity of the situation. As queen, she had direct access to the king, but she needed to be careful in how she approached the matter. Esther decided to act wisely. She revealed the plot to King Ahasuerus, but made a point of making it clear that the information had come from Mordecai. King Ahasuerus, upon hearing of the plan, was alarmed and immediately ordered an investigation to be conducted. Bigtha and Teres were interrogated, and their dark intentions soon came to light. The sentence was swift and severe. The two conspirators were executed, as a way of protecting the king and demonstrating that no treason would be tolerated in the kingdom. But the episode did not end there. The king, impressed by Mordecai's loyalty, had the deed of the man who had saved his life recorded in the annals of the kingdom. In those detailed records, it was written how Mordecai, a simple man, had shown courage and prudence in unmasking the conspiracy. Although Mordecai received no immediate reward, he did not care. For him, the satisfaction was in knowing that he had done the right thing, protecting not only the king, but also the stability of the kingdom where he lived. However, the records of that act would be of vital importance in the future, showing that, in decisive moments, even seemingly simple gestures can have grandiose consequences. As night fell upon Shushan and the palace returned to its routine, Mordecai remained at his post, watchful. He knew that this was just one small piece of a much larger plan that God was drawing. Even without fully understanding what was coming, Mordecai trusted that everything was in the hands of the Most High, who placed each person in the right place at the right time. The rise of Haman. The mood in Shushan's palace was different. Among the marble corridors and lavish halls, there was one name that was beginning to resonate strongly: Haman. He was a shrewd man, with an ambition as great as the Persian kingdom itself. He was always impeccably dressed, with ornaments that displayed his status and growing power. Haman knew how to please the right people, especially King Ahasuerus, and it was through this political skill that he quickly rose to a prominent position. The king, impressed by Haman's loyalty and apparent abilities, decided to elevate him to a position of great authority. Haman became the most powerful man in the kingdom, just below Ahasuerus himself. His new position came with immense privileges, but also with a symbolic requirement: everyone who passed by it had to bow as a sign of respect. To Haman, this was more than a gesture of submission, it was a proof of his power. Whenever he entered a room or crossed the streets of the citadel, he expected everyone, without exception, to bow before him. And so it happened. The people, fearing reprisals, bowed their heads quickly at the sight of him, murmuring words of obedience. To Haman, this scene was like music to his ears. However, there was an exception. Among the crowd that prostrated, a man stood firm, with his head held high. Mordecai, the Jew who often stood at the palace gates, refused to bow down to Haman. For Mordecai, there was only one who deserved his reverence: Almighty God. At first, Haman did not notice Mordecai's attitude. But when his servants informed him that a man dared to defy his command, Haman's pride was deeply wounded. He began to watch Mordecai closely, hoping that at some point he would give in and do what everyone else did. But Mordecai remained unshaken, day after day, even under Haman's withering gaze. Mordecai's refusal was not the fruit of rebellion, but of faithfulness. He knew that his loyalty to the Lord was non-negotiable, even if it meant facing the wrath of a man as powerful as Haman. Haman, on the other hand, could not endure such an affront. His pride turned to hatred, and this hatred began to consume his thoughts. It was not enough to punish Mordecai, Haman wanted something much bigger. He desired to eliminate not only this man, but all who shared his faith and origin. Thus, his ambition turned into a cruel plan that would endanger the entire Jewish nation. Haman's ascension marked the beginning of a period of tension and darkness in the kingdom. Although he held the highest position after the king, Haman did not understand that true power came not from titles or honors, but from divine sovereignty. He was just a cog in a much larger plan, a plan he couldn't see, but one that God was controlling at every turn. As Haman plotted his vengeance and Mordecai remained faithful, history took a turn that would transform not only the fate of both of them, but that of all of God's people. Haman's hatred of the Jews. Haman's hatred of the Jews. Mordecai's rejection resounded like a nagging echo in Haman's mind. Each day that passed, his fury grew, fueled by the wounded pride and public humiliation of a single man who refused to bow. For Haman, this was not only a challenge to his authority, it was a personal affront that he could not ignore. But Haman was not the type to be content with revenge against just one person. His hatred was voracious, and in his dark mind arose a devastating idea: why limit himself to Mordecai, when he could punish all the people to whom he belonged? Thus, Haman's plan began to take shape, turning into something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Haman began to closely observe the Jews living in the vast Persian kingdom. He realized that, like Mordecai, they too had a faith that could not be broken, a God whom they worshipped above all else. In Haman's eyes, this made them a threat. Shrewdly, he decided to use his newfound power to not only destroy Mordecai, but eradicate the entire Jewish nation. The plan called for strategy, and Haman knew exactly how to manipulate King Ahasuerus. One morning, with a calculated smile on his face, Haman presented himself to the king. He chose his words carefully, placing himself as a counselor concerned with the welfare of the kingdom. "Your Majesty," he began, in a grave tone, "there is a people scattered and dispersed among the provinces of your kingdom. They are different from all other peoples, their laws are unique, and they do not follow the king's decrees. This difference, O great king, is dangerous. If we let them act, your authority will be challenged." Ahasuerus, trusting Haman and not bothering to check the facts, was easily influenced. Haman, seeing the king's attention, continued, "If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And to show my loyalty, I offer a large sum of silver for the treasuries of the kingdom to finance this task." The king, unaware of the devastating impact of such a decree, removed his signet ring, the symbol of his authority, and gave it to Haman. "Do as you see fit with these people," Ahasuerus said, allowing Haman to act with complete freedom. With the ring in hand, Haman felt the power pulsing in his fingers. He quickly drafted the decree, detailing the day when all Jews in the kingdom, men, women, and children, would be exterminated. The decree left no room for escape, and those who participated in the massacre could loot the property of the victims, making the proposal even more attractive to greedy subjects. Haman sent the decree to all the provinces of the kingdom, each with its own official seal, ensuring that the order was obeyed. Messengers rode day and night, carrying the terrible news to every corner of the empire. Meanwhile, Haman rejoiced. He imagined Mordecai and all the Jewish people being destroyed, and his satisfaction was evident in every step he took through the corridors of the palace. But Haman underestimated something crucial: Israel's God was watchful, and his plans always prevail, even in the face of the most wicked plots. The news of the decree fell like a bombshell on the Jews. Fear and despair spread quickly. They wondered, why was this happening? How could they escape an order that came from the king himself? And as Haman celebrated, Mordecai and Esther prepared to face the greatest challenge of their lives. Haman's evil plan, cruel and far-reaching as it was, could not overcome the divine purpose. God was already moving invisible pieces to protect his people. The story was just beginning. Mordecai asks Esther for help. Mordecai, when he learned of the terrible decree that condemned the entire Jewish people to destruction, he was deeply shaken. He dressed in sackcloth and ashes, a traditional gesture that showed deep grief and despair. There was no hiding the pain he felt, and he walked through the palace gates wailing in a loud voice. His suffering was shared by other Jews in the kingdom, who also dressed in sackcloth and ashes, crying out to God for mercy. Esther, isolated in the royal apartments, learned of Mordecai's situation and was perplexed. As queen, she lived under the protection of the palace walls and was unaware of the details of the decree. Immediately, she sent clothes to Mordecai, hoping that he would change his mourning garments and be able to explain the reason for his affliction. However, Mordecai refused the clothes, insisting that she needed to hear what was happening. Through messengers, Mordecai sent Esther a copy of the royal decree, detailing Haman's evil plan and the date set for the annihilation of the Jews. He begged her to intercede with King Xerxes on behalf of the people. But Esther hesitated. Persian law was clear: no one, not even the queen, could present herself to the king without being called, on pain of death. Only if the king held out his golden scepter would the offender's life be spared. Esther's answer reached Mordecai, explaining the risks of his action. However, Mordecai sent an even firmer and more faith-filled message. He said, "Do not think that you will escape in the palace because you are queen, while all the other Jews are destroyed. If you hold your peace now, help and deliverance will come from elsewhere for the Jews, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows if it wasn't for a moment like this that you got to the position of queen?" These words struck Esther deeply. Mordecai, with his courage and trust in God's plan, challenged her to act, even in the face of mortal danger. Esther knew that she could not ignore the cry of her people or the call that was now imposed upon her. Determined, she asked Mordecai to gather all the Jews of Shushan to fast for her for 3 days, abstaining from food and drink. She and her handmaidens would do the same. After the fast, she vowed to go to the king, even if it meant risking her own life. With courage in her voice, Esther declared, "If I perish, I perish." Esther's decision was a mark of faith and bravery. Mordecai, confident in God's answer, did as she had requested. The city of Shushan was filled with solemn silence, with Jews crying out to God for intervention. In the palace, Esther prepared to face the most challenging moment of her life, aware that her position as queen was perhaps the key to the salvation of her people. Esther prepares to act. Esther, with the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, knew that the decisive moment was approaching. She had been given a mission that required not only courage but also a deep trust in God. The fate of all her people was in her hands, and she could not fail. She needed wisdom, strength, and most importantly, divine guidance for what she was about to do. It was then that Esther made an important decision. She would call on all the Jews of Shushan to join her in fasting and prayer for 3 days. She knew that prayer had power, that the collective cry could bring divine intervention. It was a radical attitude, but necessary. At first, the Jews, scattered throughout the city, may not have fully understood the risk that Esther was taking, but they were all willing to follow their leader. They would not only fast, but unite in spirit, crying out to God for the salvation of his people. During these 3 days, Esther retired to her room, away from the festivities and luxuries of the palace, and gave herself up to fasting. Without food or drink, she sought the Lord in prayer, seeking courage for the step she was about to take. She prostrated herself before God, acknowledging her weakness but at the same time reaffirming her trust in the power of the Most High. She knew she was about to defy the laws of the Persian Empire. If the king did not receive her with favor, her life would be taken, and she would die without even having a chance to speak. But as she prayed, she asked for strength, for the wisdom needed to know what to say and how to present herself. Every moment of this fasting and prayer was filled with intensity. Esther was not only preparing physically to present herself before the king, but she was preparing spiritually, seeking divine discernment for what could be one of the most dangerous acts of her life. She knew she needed a miracle. She was putting her life in God's hands, believing that He would guide her. Throughout these days of prayer, she felt the peace that only the Lord can give, a peace that strengthened her and made her feel that no matter what happened, she was doing God's will. The 3 days of fasting were over, and Esther was stronger than ever. She knew the moment had come. The spirit of determination in her heart no longer matched the doubt or fear she had felt before. She was ready. Esther then dressed herself in her best, most elegant clothes to present herself to the king. But more than her outward beauty, what shone in her at that moment was her faith. She knew she was not alone. God was with her, guiding every step, every thought, every word. Thus, with a heart full of faith, courage and trust in God, Esther prepared herself for the meeting that would change the history of the Jewish people. She knew the risk was great, but she also knew that the risk of not acting could be even greater. She stood up, with the strength that comes from prayer, ready to do what seemed impossible, approach the king without being called. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, Esther, with renewed confidence, went to the throne hall, where King Ahasuerus habitually was. The palace was silent, but Esther's heart was pounding. She knew how crucial that moment was. Any wrong move, any misplaced word, could cost him his life. Fear and anxiety were mixed with the certainty that he was doing what he should, with faith in God and in the mission he had entrusted to him. She entered the room where the king was, and the tension was palpable. Esther knew that royal protocol was clear: if the king did not extend the scepter towards her, it meant her death. The king had the power to decide his fate with a simple gesture. She approached the throne and, with her eyes fixed on the king, waited. The silence seemed to drag on, as if time had stopped. And then, with a gesture of great mercy, King Ahasuerus held out his golden scepter, symbolizing his acceptance and allowing her to approach. With the king's gesture, Esther breathed a sigh of relief. She knew that he not only accepted her, but that he was willing to listen to her. It was a rare chance, a moment of favor, and Esther could not waste it. The king, with an expression of curiosity, asked Esther what she desired. Esther, wisely and cautiously, did not reveal her request at that time. Instead, she invited the king and Haman, the most powerful official in the kingdom, to a banquet that she would prepare herself. "If it seems good to the king," she said, "come with Haman today to the banquet that I have prepared for the king." The invitation was unexpected, but the king, interested and perhaps even intrigued by Esther's stance, readily agreed. Haman, who always saw himself as superior to everyone, gladly accepted the invitation, not knowing what was about to happen. Thus, at that moment, Esther's first feast was arranged, with the king and Haman as her illustrious guests. Esther's choice not to immediately reveal the reason for her visit to the king demonstrated her careful strategy. She knew that the moment to ask the king for something so great needed to be well prepared. It would not be a hasty conversation, nor a hasty supplication. Esther wanted to make sure that the environment was conducive, that the king was willing to listen, that she had the opportunity to say the right words at the right time. The banquet, with its exquisite food and atmosphere of opulence, was an event of great importance. During the meal, the king once again asked Esther what she desired. "What is your request, Queen Esther?" he said. "It will be given to you, up to half of my kingdom." But Esther kept the mystery, responding with an even more startling proposal: "If it seems good to the king, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them." The king, still curious, agreed, and the banquet was scheduled for the next day. By visiting the banquet, Esther had taken the first step wisely. She was beginning to shape events, taking everything according to a divinely inspired plan, without rushing things. She had won the king's favor and now had the opportunity to act cautiously, like a leader who knew the value of good timing, careful preparation, and how to gain the trust of the powerful without haste. Esther's second feast. Esther's second feast was a time of great tension, a culmination of wisdom, courage, and faith. The next day, after the first feast, King Ahasuerus and Haman again presented themselves to the palace, not knowing what Esther had prepared. The scenario was more intimately charged with expectation. The food, drinks, and refined atmosphere of the banquet were only the setting, for most important of all was the secret that Esther kept, the moment when she would finally reveal her true identity and thereby change the fate of the entire Jewish people. When the king and Haman took their places, and the servants began to serve, the king, with growing curiosity, again asked Esther, as he had done at the first feast, what she desired. He was already more familiar with the quiet and mysterious posture of Esther, who, despite being queen, knew how to use her power with caution. She had earned his respect, but tension was still in the air. "King Ahasuerus," began Esther in her firm but delicate voice, "if I have found favor in your eyes, and if it seems good to the king, let him listen to me." She knew that this moment could not be rushed. The words needed to be chosen wisely, because what she was about to say would change everything. "I am Jewish," Esther continued, and that simple sentence fell like a bomb in the hall. The king, not knowing how to react, looked at Esther in silence, trying to understand the depth of what she had just revealed. Esther then told the king that a plan had been hatched against her and her people, and Haman was responsible for it. "This man, Haman, is the one who planned the destruction of all the Jews in the kingdom," she said, pointing directly to the man who until then had been seen as one of the most powerful in the empire. The room, which was once filled with laughter and conversation, has now become a place of shock and bewilderment. Haman, who would never have imagined being denounced by Esther, was astonished. The heat of his arrogance and confidence evaporated at the queen's words. King Ahasuerus, who until then did not know of Esther's true origin, felt deeply betrayed and enraged. He had been deceived by Haman, a man he had trusted so much, and now everything was falling apart before his eyes. The king immediately rose from his chair, his eyes furious, and hurried out of the hall, trying to process what he had just heard. Haman, fearing for his life, quickly got up and went to Esther, kneeling down and begging for his life. He knew that the situation was serious. The king had left, and now he stood before the queen, who possessed the ability to change the course of history with a simple gesture. When the king returned, the scene was even more dramatic. Haman, lying at Esther's feet, looked desperate. The king, seeing the scene, did not interpret this as a plea for mercy, but as an attempt to dishonor the queen. He exclaimed angrily, "Will he even assault the queen inside my palace?" The king had no more doubts about Haman's true nature. From this moment on, Haman's fate was sealed. The king ordered him to be immediately arrested and taken to be executed. And so, Haman's conspiracy against the Jewish people came to an end. Esther had risked her life, but her courage and wisdom ensured the salvation of her people. But Esther didn't stop there. She, with great wisdom, used her position to save the Jews. She asked the king that even though Haman had been punished, the decree of destruction of the Jewish people was still in effect. The king, touched by the situation, authorized Esther and Mordecai, who had now become figures of great authority in the kingdom, to write a new decree that would allow the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. From that moment on, the story of Esther became one of courage, faith, and hope for the entire Jewish people. God used Esther, a young woman who, in a time of great danger, had the courage to stand up, speak the truth, and save her people from destruction. Esther's second feast, which began with a simple meal, ended with God's victory over Haman's evil plans, and the Jewish people experienced a deliverance that would become a story of faith and courage for all generations to come. Haman's fall. Haman's fall is one of the most dramatic and surprising parts of Esther's story. After Esther revealed her identity and denounced Haman, the man who had planned the destruction of his people, King Ahasuerus was seized with an indescribable fury. He could hardly believe that Haman, to whom he had given so much power and trust, had plotted such a betrayal. The king, confused and furious, withdrew from the banquet to try to better understand the situation, but when he left, tension took over the room. While the king was away, Haman, realizing that the situation was getting out of his control, fell at Esther's feet. He was completely desperate, since, when exposed, his fate seemed already sealed. Not only had Haman ruined Esther's life by trying to exterminate her people, but he had also set himself against the king himself, who was now beginning to realize the gravity of all that had happened. Haman, with an expression of dread, tried to apologize, begging for mercy, but the scene was interpreted in a completely wrong way. When the king returned to the hall and saw Haman lying at Esther's feet, his anger increased even more. He did not understand that Haman was asking for forgiveness or pleading for his life. In the king's vision, it appeared that Haman was attacking the queen inside his own palace. The king, angry and impatient, exclaimed in a loud voice, "Will he even assault the queen in my own house?" The king's words echoed like a death sentence for Haman. There was no longer any doubt about what would happen to Haman. The king immediately ordered him to be taken away to be hanged. But Haman's punishment would be even more ironic and cruel. Haman himself, at the height of his arrogance and desire for revenge, had a huge gallows built, more than 20 meters high, for the purpose of hanging Mordecai, the man who had refused to bow down to him. Haman believed that by eliminating Mordecai, his greatest enemy, he could secure his power and prestige in the kingdom. However, fate, which often seems inexplicable, turned things against him. King Ahasuerus, upon learning of the existence of the gallows built by Haman for Mordecai, decided that it would be just for Haman to be hanged on the same gallows that he had prepared for the righteous man. This was a moment of poetic justice, a turn of fortune that no one could have foreseen. The king ordered Haman to be immediately taken to the gallows and executed right there in front of everyone. When Haman was taken to the gallows that he himself had built, the sense of justice was palpable. The man who had exalted himself with so much power and pride, and who sought to destroy his own people, was now paying the price of his deeds. King Ahasuerus, in making this decision, not only punished a wicked man but also sent a clear message about the power of justice and loyalty. Haman's fall was a major turning point in history. He, who had previously seemed unbeatable, was defeated by the courage and faith of Esther, and by the justice of God. The Jewish people, who were about to be destroyed, could now breathe a sigh of relief, for the enemy who had planned their destruction was out of the way. Justice was done, and faith in God proved once more victorious. Haman's sad end also served as a reminder to all that no matter how much one seeks to do evil, truth and justice will always prevail, even when it seems that all is lost. King Ahasuerus, as well as everyone involved in the story, learned a valuable lesson that day: lying and betrayal may be powerful for a time, but truth and justice are always stronger in the end. Mordecai's honor. The story of Mordecai, which takes place shortly after Haman's fall, is one of the most moving and revealing in the Bible. After the execution of Haman, the man who had tried to destroy the Jews, a great change began to take place in the kingdom. King Ahasuerus, who now had a clearer vision of what had actually occurred, wanted to do justice and show his gratitude to Mordecai, the man who, by his loyalty and courage, had saved the kingdom from a terrible fate. Mordecai, who had been a simple steward in the palace, was called before the king. However, his life was about to change radically. The king, in an act of great honor, decided to reward him for what he had done, by unmasking Haman and saving the lives of all the Jews. For this, the king not only gave Mordecai a prize, but elevated him to a position of extreme importance and influence within the Persian Empire. The king gave Mordecai the royal ring, which had previously belonged to Haman. This was the ultimate symbol of authority in the kingdom. The ring was used to seal important decrees and decisions, and by giving it to Mordecai, the king was not only acknowledging his loyalty but also declaring that he now had the same authority as Haman, the man who had previously held that position of power. This gesture was a way of showing the people, and especially the Jews, that justice was being restored and that Mordecai, with his faithfulness to God and the king, was a man worthy of trust and honor. When Mordecai received the ring, he could not contain his surprise and gratitude. He who, until recently, was only a faithful servant in the palace, was now being exalted and recognized as a leader. In addition, the king also dressed him in royal clothes and gave him a chariot of authority, causing Mordecai to be driven throughout the city, in a parade that certainly caught everyone's attention. The people, who knew the story of Mordecai and knew of his integrity, began to celebrate and applaud. The king's gesture was not only a personal reward to Mordecai, but a symbol of how God's justice can transform lives and situations. Mordecai, who had been humiliated and despised by Haman, was now exalted before all. He, who had refused to bow down to Haman, was now being honored in a way he had never imagined. The king, in his wisdom, not only corrected the injustice that had been done to the Jews, but also restored Mordecai's name, making him an example of honor, courage, and faithfulness. This change in status also had a profound impact on the entire nation. The Jews, who were in danger of annihilation, now saw the restoration of the honor and dignity of their people, represented in Mordecai. He not only saved his life, but also that of many others. With the royal ring and the authority given to him, Mordecai was now in a position to directly influence the destinies of the kingdom. And so Mordecai, the faithful man who trusted God and did what was right, was exalted, not by his own strength or ambitions, but because he remained steadfast in his faith and principles, even in the face of great challenges. King Ahasuerus, by bestowing such an honor on him, was not only rewarding a good man, but also demonstrating that truth and justice always prevail, even when all seems lost. Mordecai's honor was not only an earthly reward but also a reminder to all of us that when we remain true to God's principles, He exalts us in ways that can change our lives and the lives of those around us. The revocation of the decree. The situation was critical, and the fate of the Jewish people seemed sealed. Haman's decree, signed by King Xerxes, allowed the enemies of the Jews to attack and exterminate them, without mercy, throughout the empire. On the death of Haman, wickedness still hung over the Jews, for, though he had been punished, the decree was still in force, and could not be simply revoked, owing to the immutable laws of the Persian Empire. But God wasn't done with the story, and now, Esther and Mordecai needed to act with courage, wisdom, and faith. When Esther presented herself to the king and revealed Haman's plot, the king had given Mordecai the royal ring, symbolizing authority and power. Now, with this new position of influence, Mordecai joined with Esther to create a solution, an action that not only sought to save the lives of the Jews but also to correct the injustice that had been perpetrated. First, Esther and Mordecai worked together to draft a new decree. They knew that although Haman's first edict was irrevocable, there was a possibility that it would still protect the Jews. The new decree was to be sent to all the provinces of the empire, authorizing the Jews to defend themselves from attacks and to fight for their survival if they were attacked. The idea was not only to allow defense, but also to give Jews legal permission to take action against their enemies, now becoming agents of their own protection. With the help of King Xerxes, the new edict was quickly prepared and sealed with Mordecai's royal ring. This was a crucial step, for with the royal seal, the decree now became legal and had the same force as Haman's previous one. Mordecai, now with the power to influence the king, helped draft the careful words that would allow the Jews to protect themselves from their persecutors. Esther, with her wisdom and vision, worked tirelessly alongside Mordecai, knowing that the survival of her people depended on that moment. The new edict was then sent urgently to all the provinces of the empire, which extended from one end to the other. Messengers rushed to cities, towns, and villages, carrying the decree to each of the 127 provinces. The announcement that the Jews could now defend themselves was greeted with relief, as it gave them the opportunity to resist, to fight for their lives and the lives of their families. The news spread like wildfire throughout the empire. In the distant lands and in the great cities, the Jews now knew they had a chance. They were no longer defenseless, at the mercy of their enemies. With this new decree, Esther and Mordecai had turned a day of impending doom into an opportunity for resistance. The Jewish people were now legally allowed to protect themselves. And it was not only a relief for the Jews. This decree brought about a great change in the atmosphere of the kingdom. The people who had once feared for the lives of the Jews began to see the courage of a people who were unwilling to be defeated. The Jewish people, who had previously been marked for destruction, were now being defended and raised up. This revocation of the death decree and the creation of a new edict of defense was not just a matter of policy, but clear evidence that God's hand was at work behind the scenes. Despite the immutable laws of the Persian Empire, God made justice prevail and gave the Jews a fighting chance for their survival. The work of Esther and Mordecai, united by a greater purpose, turned the impending tragedy into an opportunity for victory and restoration. They showed that even in the darkest circumstances, faith in God and the courage to act can reverse even the most devastating decrees. The Jewish people now had a fighting chance, and this was a reflection of how faithfulness to God and a willingness to act, even in times of great adversity, can lead to salvation. The salvation of the Jews and the institution of Purim. The day had come. The moment that seemed to be the end of the Jewish people was about to come to fruition, but thanks to the courage of Esther and the wisdom of Mordecai, a great upheaval was about to take place. Haman's decree, which had authorized the massacre of the Jews, had now been replaced by a royal edict that allowed the Jews to defend themselves. But that didn't mean the battle was already won. On the contrary, the Jewish people would need to fight for their survival, for the lives of their children, parents, and siblings. The day designated for the massacre, the 13th day of the month of Adar, was marked with great tension. The Jews were prepared, no longer as helpless victims, but as warriors ready to defend their homes, their families, and their lives. They gathered in communities throughout the Persian Empire, with renewed courage, knowing that they were now protected by law, and that they could withstand the attacks of their enemies. When the sun rose on that fateful day, the Jewish people prepared for battle. But they were not alone. God, who had always been the protector of Israel, was with them. In the words of Mordecai and Esther, in their actions and prayers, there was an unshakable faith that, with God's help, evil would not prevail. In every city, village, and region, the Jews rose up to confront their persecutors. And what happened that day was a great miracle. Under the guidance of the new decree, and with God-given strength, the Jews defended themselves with dexterity and courage. They defeated their enemies, who, for the most part, were unprepared for such resistance. The fear and strength of the Jewish people, now united by faith and the right to fight, caused panic among those who had been assigned to their destruction. The attack that once seemed like a death sentence was now a moment of great victory. In all the provinces of the empire, Jews united in battles to defend their lives, and the result was clear: their enemies were defeated, and the Jewish people survived. The victory was total. Those who had conspired to exterminate the Jews were defeated, and the Jews, now protected by the new law, were able to live in peace. This victory was not only a military victory, but a great spiritual victory. The Jewish people had not only defeated their enemies, but they had also experienced divine intervention in a time of great need. They knew that it was not only the human arm that had defended them, but the hand of God that had protected them. In thanksgiving to God for their salvation, and in celebration of the victory they had won, the Jewish people instituted the festival of Purim. This festival was established as a way to forever remember God's great intervention in their lives, of how He had turned a day of destruction into a day of triumph. Purim was marked by feasts, prayers, and joy. People gathered to share food, to give gifts to each other, especially to those in need, and to thank God for salvation. During Purim, the Jews also read the story of Esther in their synagogues, recalling the great courage of Esther and Mordecai, and the way God used those moments of danger to save His people. This festival has become an annual tradition, celebrated with great enthusiasm and gratitude. Even today, thousands of years later, Purim continues to be celebrated by Jews around the world. It is a time of joy, of unity, and of remembrance of how, even in the darkest hours, God always has a plan to save His people. The Feast of Purim is a testament to how faithfulness to God, the courage of His servants, and divine intervention can bring salvation and transform a destiny of destruction into a celebration of life. And so, the Jewish people forever remembered the day they were saved. Purim was not just a feast, but a symbol of the struggle for life, courage in the face of evil, and trust in God, who always hears the prayers of His people and protects them in times of danger. And through Purim, the memory of this salvation was perpetuated, passed down from generation to generation, as an eternal reminder of God's faithfulness.